On a cold winter morning, January 2nd, 1873, the little town of Alençon in Normandy awoke to another day of quiet industry. Lace-making workshops hummed, the river Sarthe flowed slowly past stone houses, and in a modest home above a lace business, a newborn baby girl drew her first breaths. She was named Marie-Françoise Thérèse Martin. Her parents, Louis Martin and Zélie Guérin, already had 8 children, though by this time they had also buried several. The Martin household knew both joy and sorrow intimately. Louis, a watchmaker by trade before he turned to the lace business to support his family, was a man of calm dignity, prayerful and steady. Zélie, whose lace was admired across the region, possessed a strong spirit and unwavering faith. Together, they raised their children in an atmosphere where religion was not only practiced but lived, where prayer framed every morning and night, and where trust in God infused even the smallest details of daily life. From the beginning, Thérèse was fragile. Her mother's letters reveal an anxious love for her youngest child, whom she called the Little Queen. Because she was so delicate, Thérèse was sent to live for over a year with a wet nurse in the countryside until she gained strength. When she returned, the house rang with laughter again. The golden-haired, blue-eyed child was doted upon by her older sisters, Marie, Pauline, Léonie, and Céline. Each had her own personality. Marie was practical and maternal, Pauline was wise and spiritual, Léonie struggled with fits of mood and misunderstanding, and Céline was lively and playful, only a few years older than Thérèse. The home itself was warm with activity. Zélie oversaw the lace work with precision while instructing her daughters in the catechism. Louis managed the household affairs and found time for fishing trips and quiet walks. Meals were simple but shared with gratitude, and every evening ended with the family gathered in prayer. For little Thérèse, this early atmosphere planted seeds of piety that would never leave her. Her childhood world was small yet rich with imagination. In the garden, she played with Céline, inventing stories about castles, knights, and saints. She had a knack for slipping into daydreams, her large eyes staring off as though she were already conversing with invisible friends. When dolls or small gifts were placed in her hands, she treated them not as toys, but as companions in her make-believe dramas. One day she might crown her doll as a queen, another day she might scold it as though correcting a wayward child. It was as if even in play she rehearsed the roles of a mother, a sister, and one who longed to guide souls. But the Martins were not spared sorrow. In 1877, when Thérèse was only 4, her beloved mother died of breast cancer. The loss shook the family to its core. For little Thérèse, the event left an indelible wound. She clung to her father with tears and asked endlessly when her maman would return. Louis, bereft yet determined, decided to move his family to Lisieux, nearer to his in-laws, the Guérins. There, in the house called Les Bissonnets, Thérèse's childhood would continue, shaped by memory and longing for her mother. The absence of Zélie became a defining mark. Though surrounded by loving sisters, Thérèse developed a sensitivity that was almost too delicate for the world. A harsh word could reduce her to sobs, while a small gesture of affection could brighten her entire day. Her family noticed her tender conscience. If she thought she had done wrong, she would cry bitterly until reassured of forgiveness. This sensitivity, though difficult, also inclined her toward prayer. She began to turn to the Blessed Virgin Mary as a mother. Often she would slip into the family garden, kneel before a small statue of Our Lady, and whisper, "You will be my mother now." Pauline, in particular, became a second mother to her. The bond between the two was so strong that Thérèse later admitted she could not imagine life without Pauline's guidance. Marie also provided a sense of order, while Céline remained her closest companion in games. Even Léonie, though often moody, drew her sympathy. Thérèse's childhood was thus not solitary but interwoven with family ties, each sister playing a role in shaping her personality. School life, however, was another matter. Sent to the Benedictine school in Lisieux, Thérèse found herself shy and easily wounded by the jibes of other children. Though intelligent and quick to learn, she often dissolved into tears when corrected or teased. Teachers remarked on her brightness, but worried about her extreme sensitivity. At recess, she gravitated toward Celine or remained quiet, observing rather than joining in rough play. She did not excel in confidence, but she grew in depth of feeling. One early trial that revealed her spirit came when a small girl in the schoolyard taunted her cruelly. Instead of retaliating, Thérèse turned away and whispered a prayer for her tormentor. The incident left her shaken, but she also discovered something of her vocation: to answer harshness with gentleness, to meet wounds with forgiveness. Her prayer life deepened as she grew older. Even before her first communion, she displayed an intensity unusual for her age. At home, she sometimes turned everyday moments into little rituals of devotion. She would gather flowers, arrange them carefully, and lay them before the family statue of the Virgin, as if presenting a gift to heaven. She delighted in making small sacrifices, giving up a favorite treat, or silently offering a discomfort, to please Jesus. These acts, unnoticed by others, were the beginnings of her little way. The defining crisis of her childhood came when she was 10 years old. By this time, Pauline, her second mother, announced her decision to enter the Carmelite convent in Lisieux. The news struck Thérèse like a thunderbolt. To lose her mother was one wound. To lose Pauline felt like a second. She became gravely ill, suffering mysterious fevers and tremors that baffled doctors. Her sisters prayed desperately. Then, on May 13, 1883, as she lay in her bed, something extraordinary occurred. A small statue of the Virgin Mary stood nearby. In her weakness, Thérèse turned her gaze toward it. Suddenly, she saw the statue come alive with a smile so radiant that it seemed to fill her entire being with peace. From that instant, she was healed. The family recognized it as a miracle. For Thérèse, it became a moment she never forgot. The smile of Mary, the tenderness of heaven reaching into her pain. This was not just a physical cure, but a spiritual turning point, anchoring her devotion to the Virgin for the rest of her life. Yet her trials were not over. At 13, she entered what she later described as the most difficult period of her youth. Her sensitivity was still so strong that she was easily wounded. A single thoughtless remark could send her into hours of tears. She wanted to be good, but she felt trapped by her emotions. Even her sisters worried that she would never grow strong enough to embrace a religious vocation. But grace intervened on Christmas Eve, 1886. After midnight mass, the family returned home, and as was French custom, the younger children found gifts placed in their shoes. Louis, weary and perhaps thinking his youngest had outgrown the tradition, sighed, "Thank God, this will be the last year." Thérèse overheard him. Once, such words would have shattered her heart. But instead of tears, she felt a surge of strength. She ran joyfully to her shoes, embraced the gifts, and showed no sign of hurt. Later she would call this her complete conversion, a sudden maturity of soul, when she no longer allowed herself to be ruled by emotion. It was, she said, the grace that freed her spirit to live not for herself, but for others. From then on, her life took a new direction. She began to pray with greater purpose, longing for holiness not in grand gestures, but in daily fidelity. She dreamed of Carmel, of joining Pauline and offering herself wholly to God. Though only a teenager, her heart was already fixed on a vocation that seemed beyond her years. After that night of Christmas 1886, Thérèse Martin was no longer the fragile, tearful girl her family had worried over. Something had shifted inside her. It was as though grace had given her a new backbone, a new freedom. She still had her tender heart, but now it was anchored in strength. Her sisters noticed the change almost immediately. Where once she might have cried over a small correction, she now responded with composure. Where she once retreated into herself at the first sign of trouble, she now smiled with quiet confidence. The next great milestone in her adolescence came the following year, when she prepared for her first communion. The catechism classes at the Benedictine school in Lisieux suddenly became alive to her. She devoured the lessons on the Eucharist, not as mere ideas but as promises of intimacy with Christ. Every evening, she pored over her prayer book, reciting prayers of preparation with eagerness. Pauline's departure into Carmel still pained her, but she felt closer than ever to Jesus, who seemed to fill the void left in her heart. On May 8, 1884, she received her first communion. She would later describe it as the happiest day of her life. Dressed in white, her face radiant, she approached the altar with hands folded tightly. As the host touched her tongue, she felt overwhelmed by a sense of union so deep that it was indescribable. She later wrote that Jesus and Thérèse were no longer two, but one. In the joy of that moment, she silently resolved to give her life entirely to him. From then on, her devotion to the Eucharist became the heartbeat of her spirituality. Every communion was a renewal of that first, a deepening of the bond she felt in her soul. Her adolescence was also marked by a deepening relationship with her father. Louis Martin, with his quiet dignity and strong faith, had always been a heroic figure in her eyes. After Zélie's death, Thérèse had clung to him with special tenderness. They shared walks in the garden at Les Bissonnets, fishing excursions, and quiet moments of prayer. She called him her king, and he called her his little queen. Their bond was so strong that people around them sometimes marveled at it. For Thérèse, her father embodied the gentleness and strength of God himself. Yet life was not without trial. In 1887, when she was 14, she found herself gripped by a burning desire that would not let her rest. She wanted to enter Carmel. She spoke of it with Céline during their walks, describing her longing to give everything to God, to be enclosed in the convent where Pauline and Marie already lived. Céline, who loved her dearly, understood but was hesitant. It seemed impossible. Thérèse was still so young, far below the minimum age of admission. Others laughed at the idea when she spoke of it. But her determination only grew stronger. Her father, who had given so many daughters to God already, did not dismiss her dream. Instead, he listened carefully. One day, on a quiet afternoon walk, she poured out her heart to him. "Papa, I must go to Carmel," she said simply. Louis stopped walking. His face, lined by both joy and sorrow, revealed the weight of the moment. After a pause, he picked a small flower from the path and handed it to her. "See this little flower, my Thérèse?" he said softly. "God has created it just as it is, in its smallness, to show his glory. And so, too, he has created you. If he wants you in Carmel, who am I to stand in his way?" Encouraged by her father's blessing, Thérèse set about seeking official permission. But the Carmelite convent in Lisieux was reluctant. At 15, she was considered too young. The local bishop gave a cautious answer, suggesting she wait. For Thérèse, this was agony. Her soul felt consumed with longing, as if she would die if she could not enter soon. She prayed with tears and vigils, offered every small sacrifice she could think of, rising in the cold, giving up small comforts, staying silent when teased, as though each act might persuade heaven to open the doors sooner. That same year, Louis decided to take Thérèse and Céline on a pilgrimage to Rome with a group of French pilgrims. It was a journey meant to strengthen their faith, but Thérèse saw it as her great chance. At the top of her mind was one thought: she would speak to the Pope himself. The trip itself was full of wonder for the young girl who had never traveled far from Normandy. They passed through Paris, Florence, Venice, and finally arrived in the Eternal City. Thérèse marveled at the grandeur of basilicas, the ancient ruins, the art, and the relics of saints. But her heart was set on the audience with Pope Leo XIII. She rehearsed what she would say, prayed for courage, and begged her guardian angel to help her. On November 20th, 1887, the pilgrims gathered in the Vatican audience room. One by one, they knelt before the Holy Father, kissed his ring, and received his blessing. When Thérèse's turn came, she knelt as expected, but instead of rising, she clasped his hands tightly and cried out, "Most Holy Father, I have a great favor to ask of you. Permit me to enter Carmel at the age of 15. The room fell silent. The Pope, surprised by the intensity of the young girl, leaned toward her. An attendant tried to pull her back, but she clung to his knees, repeating her plea with tears. Finally, Leo XIII placed his hand gently on her head and said, "You will enter if God wills it." The guards had to lift her to her feet and lead her away. For most, it was an embarrassing breach of protocol. But for Thérèse, it was a confirmation. She had done all she could. Now the rest was in God's hands. When they returned to Lisieux, the bishop reconsidered her case. Perhaps impressed by her determination, or convinced by the family's petitions, he granted permission. On April 9th, 1888, Thérèse, now 15 years and 3 months old, crossed the threshold of the Carmelite convent of Lisieux. The heavy door closed behind her, and she felt a joy so complete that she thought her heart might burst. The world was left behind. She was finally home. Life in Carmel, however, was far from the romantic dream she had imagined. The convent was austere, small cells with bare furnishings, unheated corridors where the cold bit in winter, food so plain it was sometimes hard to swallow, and long hours of silence and prayer. For a girl raised in a loving household, it was a sharp adjustment. But Thérèse embraced it with eagerness. One of the first long stories from her convent life reveals her spirit. Assigned to laundry duty, she found herself scrubbing clothes in icy water, her hands raw and red. Beside her, another sister splashed her carelessly, soaking her habit. At first, irritation flared in her heart, but immediately, she offered it up as a sacrifice. She forced a smile, continued her work, and silently prayed for that sister. Later she would tell the novices, "That is how one proves love, not with great deeds, but with small sacrifices offered with joy." Another story came from her interactions with a sister who annoyed her profoundly. This nun had a sharp tongue and a manner that grated on Thérèse's sensitive soul. Each time they crossed paths, Thérèse felt the temptation to turn away or show impatience. But instead, she deliberately smiled, spoke kindly, and performed little acts of service for her. The nun, unsuspecting, once remarked, "I cannot imagine why Sister Thérèse loves me so much." For Thérèse, this was the triumph of grace, to love not by feeling but by choice. In recreation hours, she surprised her sisters with her creativity. To celebrate feast days, the nuns sometimes staged little plays. Thérèse wrote short dramas with religious themes and often played leading roles. She loved to portray saints, Joan of Arc above all. Wearing makeshift armor and carrying a wooden sword, she declaimed lines of faith and courage that left the community in awe. In Joan, she saw a mirror of her own zeal, a young girl called by God to do great things, not through strength, but through love and obedience. The daily life of Carmel became a field of hidden victories. Rising in the chill of dawn, she dragged herself from bed not reluctantly but with eagerness, whispering, "For you, Jesus." When food was distasteful, she ate it with gratitude. When the silence of the convent weighed heavy, she offered it as a song of love. These small acts, unnoticed by most, were the building blocks of her little way. By the time she was 17, Thérèse was already recognized by her sisters as a soul of unusual depth. Though still young, She radiated a joy and serenity that drew others to her. She was not immune to difficulty, but she had discovered how to transform every trial, however small, into an offering. Carmel was no longer an idea. It was her daily reality, and she embraced it completely. When Thérèse entered Carmel, she had imagined a place of peace and holy harmony. In her mind, the cloister was filled with radiant souls praying without ceasing, their lives aflame with love. But soon she discovered that Carmel was also made up of ordinary human beings, with their quirks, limitations, and tensions. This discovery did not disillusion her. Rather, it gave her a new field for her vocation. She realized holiness was not about escaping human weakness, but about transforming it through love. The daily schedule of the convent was strict. Rising at dawn, the sisters filed into the chapel for matins, voices weaving together in psalms sung in the half-light of candles. Hours of silence followed, broken only by the bells that marked prayer, work, meals, and recreation. Each sister was assigned her tasks: cooking, cleaning, sewing, gardening. Thérèse, though frail, was given no exemptions. She embraced everything, whether sweeping the corridors, folding altar linens, or weeding in the garden under the hot Norman sun. It was in these very ordinary tasks that she practiced her little way. Once, when told to sweep a particularly dusty passage that few ever walked, she bent to her work with joy, imagining that each stroke of the broom was a prayer. To her, the hiddenness of the task made it even more precious. No one would see, but God would. During recreation, when the sisters were permitted to speak freely, Thérèse's personality blossomed. Far from being solemn and withdrawn, she laughed easily and told stories that lifted the mood of the room. Her wit was quick, her smile radiant. Some of the older nuns, surprised at the brightness of her spirit, began to confide in her. She had a way of listening intently, as though each word spoken carried great weight. The prioress soon noticed her gifts and assigned her to help guide the novices. Though young herself, she possessed a wisdom that did not come from books but from lived experience. She told the novices not to worry about achieving perfection through great deeds, but to begin with the little things. Smile when you do not feel like smiling. Pick up what others leave behind. Answer gently when you want to be sharp. One novice later said that the simplest advice from Thérèse carried more power than pages of lofty instruction. One long story illustrates her influence. A young novice, overwhelmed by the severity of convent life, confessed to her in tears that she could not go on, that the silence, the cold, the unending rules were crushing her spirit. Thérèse took her hand and said softly, "Do you think I feel strong every day? No, I feel very small. But God loves smallness. He bends down to lift us when we cannot lift ourselves. Let us be children, and let Him carry us." The novice later testified that this conversation gave her the courage to persevere. Thérèse's prayer life deepened in intensity. She loved to spend hours before the tabernacle, not with elaborate words, but with silent presence. "I look at Him, and He looks at me," she once said. In those hours, she sometimes felt torrents of love wash over her soul. At other times, she felt nothing but emptiness. Yet she came faithfully, whether consoled or dry, offering her presence as a gift. One night during adoration, she experienced what she later described as a burning desire for souls. Kneeling in the dark chapel, she felt as though her heart could not contain the love surging within. She prayed fervently for sinners, for missionaries, for the church. In that moment, she felt united not just to her small convent, but to the entire world. She understood her vocation as universal. I will be love in the heart of the church. Her imaginative creativity also continued within the convent walls. For feast days, she organized small dramas or poetic recitations. But she used these occasions not only to entertain, but to instruct. In one play, she portrayed an angel who encouraged a weary soul to trust in God's mercy. The sisters who watched felt uplifted, sensing that she was not merely acting but speaking out of the depths of her own soul. Another story reveals her humor and humility. She was once assigned to work in the refectory, serving meals. One day she accidentally dropped a pitcher, spilling water everywhere. Some nuns looked disapprovingly at the mess. Instead of blushing or growing defensive, she laughed aloud, cleaned it up quickly, and said cheerfully, "Another opportunity to begin again." Her ability to turn accidents into joy left a lasting impression on her companions. By her early 20s, she had become a spiritual anchor for the community. She had no grand position, no authority by office, but her words and example carried quiet weight. She lived what she taught, that sanctity is hidden in ordinary life, in small acts done with great love. In her last years, Thérèse's spirituality reached its full flowering. Though her health grew weaker, she never let it define her. To those around her, she remained the same cheerful, encouraging presence, guiding novices, writing her reflections, and living each day with quiet fidelity. Her writings, begun at the request of Pauline, were not intended as a book, but as a gift to her sisters. She described her childhood, her little way, her life in Carmel, all with simplicity. She wrote of flowers, of children, of small offerings. She insisted that sanctity was accessible to all. Her words carried an authenticity that came from lived reality, not theory. When the story of a soul was later published, its freshness would surprise the world. One of the most moving episodes of her final years was her prayer for unbelievers. Though she herself never wavered in faith, she was allowed to experience the spiritual darkness of doubt. She felt at times as though heaven were closed, as if eternity might not exist. Instead of despairing, she embraced this trial for others. "I sit at the table of unbelievers," she said, "so that they may be nourished too." She transformed her darkness into solidarity with those far from God. Her care for the novices never ceased. Even when she grew too weak to leave her bed, she welcomed them to her infirmary. She listened, encouraged, and offered her little way as a path they could follow. One novice remembered entering her room discouraged and leaving filled with hope after hearing Thérèse say, "God does not need great deeds. He needs only your love." Stories from these final months show her undiminished humor. When a sister asked if she was discouraged by her weakness, she replied with a smile, "Oh no, I am too little to be discouraged. I just let Jesus carry me." Another time, when told she was brave to suffer so patiently, she laughed and said, "Brave? A child carried in her father's arms is not brave. She is simply loved." Her love for the missions never diminished. Though she never left Lisieux, she prayed fervently for priests and missionaries. She considered herself a sister to them, offering her hidden sacrifices for their work. She once said, "I would like to travel to every land, preach the gospel to every soul, but since I cannot, I will be love instead, and love will reach where my feet cannot go." As the end drew near, she spoke often of her mission after death. "I feel it strongly," she said. "I will spend my heaven in doing good on earth. I will let fall a shower of roses." This image of roses became her enduring symbol, the promise that her intercession would bring countless graces. Her last days were marked by peace. She did not cling to life with fear, nor did she rush toward death with impatience. She rested in trust. Surrounded by her sisters, she held a crucifix to her heart and whispered her final words, "My God, I love you." She was 24 years old. The convent buried her in quiet simplicity. Few beyond Lisieux took notice. Yet soon after, her writings began to circulate. Letters poured in from across the world, testifying to graces received through her intercession. The little flower who had hidden herself in the cloister became known far and wide. Her little way of trust and love, born in small acts and hidden sacrifices, blossomed into a message for the whole church. She had once written, "Love proves itself by deeds, and the smallest act of love is of infinite value." That conviction shaped her entire life, from her childhood sensitivity, through her hidden life in Carmel, to her final offering of herself to merciful love. Her story was not of grandeur, but of littleness embraced and transformed. And it is precisely for this reason that the world has never forgotten her.